The Secondigliano Feud, a dark chapter of Naples. October 28, 2004. Naples. The city had just begun to wake when two sharp cracks of gunfire tore through the air. They weren't echoes of fireworks, not the celebratory sounds Neapolitans knew so well during festivals or football victories. These were pistol shots, precise, merciless, echoing between the narrow streets like a curse. A man collapsed onto the asphalt, his body twisted awkwardly in a pool of his own blood. His name was Fulvio Montanino, right-hand man to Cosimo di Loro, the new heir of one of the most feared clans in Italy. Next to him lay another, Claudio Salerno, struck down just as ruthlessly. What neither of them knew, in those last agonizing seconds of life, was that their deaths would ignite one of the bloodiest mafia wars modern Europe had ever seen. In little more than a year, the neighborhoods of Scampia and Secondigliano would become a war zone. 70 dead, families shattered, lifelong friends turned into executioners, fathers hunting sons, sons betraying fathers. An empire of crime that had ruled like a monarchy was about to crumble into dust and blood. This is the story of the Secondigliano Feud. A story so brutal that even the book Gomorrah and the hit television series it inspired could barely capture its savagery. What you are about to hear is darker than fiction. It is the cruel rhythm of real streets, of real lives destroyed. And I am your narrator, guiding you through the shadows. The rise of an empire. To understand the feud, we must go back to the late 1990s. In those years, Paolo di Loro, known on the streets as Ceruso o Milionario, Ceruso the Millionaire, reigned supreme. He was no mere neighborhood boss. He was a monarch of the narcotics world, a king who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Scampia and Secondigliano, neighborhoods on the northern edges of Naples, had long been associated with poverty, unemployment, and suffocating concrete housing projects. Yet in this bleak urban sprawl, Paolo had built an empire. His syndicate controlled some of the most lucrative drug markets in all of Europe. Tens of millions of euros flowed through his network every month, funneled from heroin, cocaine, and hashish, sold on open-air drug plazas that operated like supermarkets of addiction. The Italian investigators called it the Alleanza di Secondigliano, the Secondigliano Alliance, a cartel that united clans under a single crown. 4 years, it dominated with ruthless efficiency. Paolo himself was rarely seen on the front lines. Unlike the flashy gangsters who flaunted gold chains and sports cars, Di Loro was pragmatic, calculated, almost invisible. His empire thrived not on chaos, but on order, discipline, and careful diplomacy. But like every empire in history, there was a fatal flaw. And that flaw was family. Paolo had 10 sons. 10 young men destined, perhaps inevitably, to inherit his throne. In 2002, when a police raid landed Paolo behind bars, power passed to his eldest, Cosimo. The streets nicknamed him F1, a nod to his passion for Formula One racing. The transition might have seemed natural, almost dynastic. But this wasn't the cautious handover of a legitimate business. This was the Mafia. Power here was not inherited, it had to be enforced, proven in blood. Cosimo was not his father. Where Paolo was patient, Cosimo was impulsive. Where Paolo was diplomatic, Cosimo was violent. At just 30 years old, he suddenly found himself at the helm of an empire stretching across Europe. And unlike his father, who understood the delicate balance of keeping allies close and rivals in check, Cosimo distrusted the old guard. He surrounded himself with young men of his own generation. Fierce, loyal, but inexperienced. He pushed aside the veterans, the same men who had built his father's fortune. Among those veterans was Rafael Amato, known as Lello o Sicco or sometimes O Rello. He was no ordinary soldier. Amato was a narcotics trafficker of international standing, with connections in Spain, the Netherlands, and beyond. He had overseen shipments, commanded respect, and forged alliances across borders. But under Cosimo's rule, he found himself sidelined, his influence dismissed, his profits dwindling. To a man like Amato, it wasn't just about money, it was about respect, status, legacy. Tensions grew. At first quietly, like cracks spreading across marble. Then louder, bolder, until betrayal no longer seemed unthinkable but inevitable. The first cracks. It began, as so many wars do, with disputes over money. Amato and his allies complained openly. The Di Loro brothers were hoarding too much of the profits, leaving scraps for the veterans who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Paolo. But beneath the financial grievances lay something deeper: resentment, humiliation, wounded pride. One by one, the discontented gathered around Amato. Among them was Gennaro Marino, known as Mackay, Cesare Pagano, and other longtime affiliates who had been cut out of the new order. They began to call themselves Gli Secessionisti, the secessionists. But they preferred another name, Gli Spagnoli, the Spaniards, because many of them had operational bases in Spain, where they ran drug trafficking routes independent of Cosimo's command. By 2004, the tension had reached a boiling point. Two sides had emerged. On one side, Cosimo Di Loro and his circle of loyalists, young, aggressive, reckless. On the other, Rafael Amato and the secessionists, hardened veterans who knew the business inside out. They were men who had once shared meals, celebrated weddings, baptized each other's children. And now, they were preparing to kill one another. October 28, 2004. The spark. That morning, Fulvio Montanino and Claudio Salerno left home as they always did, unaware that fate had already sealed their names in blood. The ambush was surgical. The killers knew their routines, their routes, the precise moment they would be vulnerable. This was no random strike. It was betrayal born from inside knowledge. Only insiders could have arranged it, men who had once stood beside them. When Montanino's body hit the pavement, Naples changed forever. At first, even Cosimo was in disbelief. Who had dared to challenge the Di Loro family? Who was bold enough, or suicidal enough, to shoot down his right-hand man? Confusion reigned. Whispers circled like vultures. The answer revealed itself quickly. The enemy was not some external rival, not a distant clan from Calabria or Sicily. It was their own brothers in arms. The secessionists had declared war. And Cosimo's response would be fire and fury. Streets of War. Naples, late 2004. The city that tourists knew for its ancient ruins, Baroque churches, and glittering coastline was, in Scampia and Secondigliano, something else entirely. Towering concrete blocks rose like fortresses, their stairwells darkened with graffiti, their courtyards echoing with the cries of children playing amid the tension. To outsiders, these neighborhoods were almost impenetrable, a labyrinth of alleyways and high-rises, where the state rarely ventured. Now they would become battlefields. The killings escalated almost immediately. Luigi Aliberti, an associate, was gunned down with 6 bullets to the face on Via Ghisleri. It was the first clear signal from the secessionists. They would not be cowed, they would not return quietly to the fold. Cosimo, however, was not a man to retreat. His answer was to unleash an all-out manhunt. Loyalists scoured the streets, hunting anyone suspected of allegiance to Amato. Every day brought new corpses. Drive-by shootings in broad daylight. Executions carried out with military precision. Gunfire echoing between the gray towers of Scampia, leaving mothers screaming on their balconies. The war was no longer confined to the underworld. Ordinary people, shopkeepers, students, children, found themselves caught in the crossfire. The streets reeked of gunpowder and fear. The faces of the war. To truly understand the Secondigliano feud, you must know its players. Cosimo Di Loro, F1. The heir. 30 years old. Temperamental. Merciless. To his followers, he was a prince defending his inheritance. To his enemies, he was unstable, erratic, unfit to lead. Witnesses later described him as capable of switching from calm silence to violent rage in seconds. Rafael Amato, Lello. The secessionist leader. Calm, methodical, a man who thought 3 moves ahead. Where Cosimo was impulsive, Amato was calculating. His bases in Spain gave him both refuge and resources, a steady supply of drugs to fund his war. Cesare Pagano, the strategist. Once a trusted member of the Di Loro machine, he switched sides when he realized Cosimo would never share power. He was known as one of the sharpest military minds in the Neapolitan underworld. Gennaro Marino, Mackay. A powerful figure who once stood firmly in Paolo's camp, but now a secessionist general. His control over parts of Scampia made him indispensable. And then there were the Di Loro brothers themselves. Marco Di Loro, codenamed F4, would later become one of Italy's most wanted fugitives. The family ties bound them tightly, but also painted targets on their backs. These men were not abstractions. They were flesh and blood, each with their own fears, ambitions, and ruthlessness. And together, they would plunge Naples into its darkest chapter. The War Unfolds Part 2. The death of Montanino and Salerno was more than just an execution. It was a declaration, written not in ink but in blood, across the streets of Naples. And Cosimo di Loro, young, volatile, desperate to prove himself worthy of the throne his father had left behind, was determined to answer that challenge with an iron fist. What followed was not order, not control, but chaos. Chaos so vast that Scampia and Secondigliano ceased to be neighborhoods and became battlefields. The logic of fear. Cosimo believed in terror. To him, violence was not only a tool but a language. Each death was a message, each body left in the street a letter written in crimson. Witnesses would later recall that Cosimo seemed almost satisfied, even elated, when the killings piled up. The more we killed, one former affiliate testified, the more he smiled. For him, fear was power. Fear was the foundation of his empire. His philosophy was simple. If the people of Scampia and Secondigliano were forced to choose between anarchy and his rule, they would choose him. But that logic required one thing: constant, escalating bloodshed. Gunmen loyal to Cosimo swept through the streets, targeting anyone suspected of sympathizing with the secessionists. And suspicion required little evidence. A look, a word, even silence could condemn you. The secessionists strike back. But Amato and his allies were not cowed. Unlike Cosimo's fiery but inexperienced young men, the secessionists were veterans. They had survived prison, negotiated with international cartels, and built their own criminal economies. They understood logistics, strategy, patience. They did not waste bullets. When they struck with purpose. Rafael Amato, safe in his Spanish sanctuaries, orchestrated his war like a general from afar. His lieutenants, like Cesare Pagano and Gennaro Marino, carried out the dirty work on Neapolitan soil. Their soldiers knew the streets, knew the faces of every dealer, every lookout, every errand boy. The war became chess played with human lives. Each assassination was a calculated move, each ambush designed not only to kill but to cripple the morale of the opposing clan. Innocents in the crossfire. But wars like these never stay contained. Bullets do not discriminate. Ordinary citizens, trapped by poverty in the gray high-rises of Scampia, found themselves in the crossfire. Mothers dragging groceries home from the market, children playing soccer in courtyards, teenagers walking to school. All of them lived with the constant, gnawing terror that a stray bullet might end their lives. One case would come to symbolize the senseless cruelty of the feud. The death of Gelsomina Verde. Her name was Gelsomina Verde. She was 22 years old, bright, full of life. She had no part in the Mafia, no dealings with clans. Her only crime was being romantically linked, briefly, to a man associated with the secessionists. On November 21, 2004, she was abducted. For hours she was tortured, interrogated for information she didn't have. Then, as if her suffering were not enough, she was shot, her body stuffed into a car, and the vehicle set ablaze. She had been mistaken, they said. Mistaken for someone else's sister. A miscalculation. But what does a miscalculation mean when it leaves a young woman burned alive? The murder of Gelsomina shook Naples. It was a line crossed, a brutality so obscene that even hardened residents of Scampia wept in disbelief. For the first time, the Italian public outside Naples paid attention. Newspapers splashed her photo across their front pages. Politicians denounced the violence. For a moment, Italy's gaze turned toward the dark corners it usually ignored. But for Cosimo and his men, it was just another step in the war. Numbers that stagger the mind. Between late 2004 and 2005, nearly 70 people would die in the feud. Some were seasoned criminals, their deaths written into the logic of gang warfare. But others were not. They were neighbors, bystanders, the unlucky who crossed the wrong street at the wrong time. Think of it. 70 funerals in just over a year. 70 families shattered. 70 names carved into tombstones, many of them young men who had barely begun to live. And those are only the confirmed deaths. Collaborators with Justice, Pentiti, later revealed that more than 35 murders could be directly traced to the feud. For the people of Scampia, violence became ordinary. Children grew up assuming they might not live to see 20. Women learned to identify the sound of pistols, to know whether to run or drop flat. Shopkeepers kept their shutters down not just to avoid stray bullets, but to avoid being seen as favoring one side or the other. Violence was no longer an interruption. It was the soundtrack of daily life. Terror as theater. One detail that investigators later revealed was chilling. Cosimo di Loro turned violence into theater. Killings were aged in broad daylight, on crowded streets, in front of cafes and markets. The message was deliberate. Nowhere was safe, no hour was sacred. Every citizen was to understand that power was decided not by laws or police, but by bullets. The old Mafia, for all its brutality, had often sought to remain hidden, to cloak itself in silence and secrecy. Cosimo shattered that tradition. He wanted visibility, wanted blood spilled like ink across the daylight. And yet, for all his bluster, Cosimo was not invincible. The state strikes back. By 2005, the war had reached such a level of horror that the Italian government could no longer look away. Public outrage, fueled by the death of innocents like Gelsomina Verde, forced Rome to act. The police, carabinieri, and anti-mafia units launched sweeping operations across Naples. Hundreds of arrests followed. Drug plazas were raided, safe houses breached, weapons seized. On December 7, 2004, Cosimo himself was captured. The young heir, who had dreamed of ruling like his father, was dragged from hiding and led away in handcuffs. For a moment, it seemed the feud might finally end. But empires like these do not collapse neatly. Cut off one head, and another grows in its place. Rafael Amado continued to operate from Spain, evading capture for years. His allies, like Cesare Pagano, carried on the fight. Marco di Loro, Cosimo's younger brother, rose in prominence, later becoming one of Italy's most wanted fugitives. Even as the state arrested hundreds, the violence mutated. The Hydra effect. The Camorra is like a Hydra. Cut off one head, and two more appear. When Paolo di Loro's empire fractured, it did not vanish. Instead, it splintered into dozens of smaller factions. The once unified Secondigliano alliance dissolved, replaced by a patchwork of gangs fighting for scraps of territory. The result was paradoxical. The Camorra became less efficient, no longer capable of running its business with the discipline Paolo once enforced. But it also became more violent. Smaller groups, desperate to prove themselves, relied even more heavily on bloodshed to establish dominance. The war had broken the crown but not the kingdom. The Pentiti voices from within. In the aftermath, many of those once loyal to the clans chose to collaborate with justice. Gennaro Naturno, known as O Saraceno, became one of the most significant Pentiti. His testimony illuminated 35 murders, offering investigators a chilling look into the mechanics of the feud. Pasquale Riccio, another former insider, explained how the decision to kill Montanino and Salerno had been reached, and how betrayal had turned allies into executioners. Even members of the Di Loro family itself provided information, revealing the internal fractures that had shattered Paolo's empire. Their voices, once whispers in the shadows, became the backbone of trials that convicted dozens. Yet in the underworld, their collaboration was seen not as justice but as treason. Pentiti lived the rest of their lives under protection, always hunted, always fearing retribution. International shadows. The feud was not limited to Naples. Because both sides had deep ties abroad, particularly in Spain, the war spilled across borders. Safe houses in Barcelona, Valencia, and Marbella became havens for fugitives. Drug shipments continued to move. Money continued to flow. Spanish police would later confirm that Naples' war had echoes on their soil, Italians arriving with scars and grudges, seeking shelter, regrouping, plotting their next moves. It was a reminder that the Camorra was not a local phenomenon. It was international, a web of narcotics and violence stretching across Europe. The legacy of Gelsomina. Yet for all the names and numbers, for all the bosses and soldiers, one memory remains most haunting: the death of Gelsomina Verde. Her photograph, her smile, her youth, became a symbol, not just of the feud, but of its obscenity. Her murder marked the moment when Naples itself seemed to recoil, to realize that this war was not the old romanticized mafia of films and stories. It was something far darker, a machine that consumed innocence without hesitation. Even today, her name is spoken with sorrow, a reminder of how easily violence spirals out of control, how a single mistake can burn a future to ashes. Toward an ending, but not a resolution. By 2009, Rafael Amato was finally arrested in Spain. In 2010, Cesare Pagano fell into custody. One by one, the architects of the feud were captured, their reigns brought to an end not by rivals but by the state. And yet, the war did not vanish. It evolved. By 2011, Naples faced a new conflict, often called the Second Scampia feud. The sons and heirs of those imprisoned took up the mantle. The cycle repeated itself: new names, new deaths, the same streets haunted by the same violence. The War Unfolds Part 3. Scampia's Children. The Maschili. To understand the feud's full cruelty, one must look not only at the bosses and their soldiers, but at the children of Scampia. The Camorra has long recruited the Maschili, young boys, sometimes no older than 10 or 12. They were used as lookouts, runners, couriers. Their job was to whistle when police entered the neighborhood, to carry packets of drugs up stairwells, to deliver messages no adult could safely carry. In a world where poverty was the rule, not the exception, many families tolerated it. A child working for the clan meant extra money, sometimes enough to buy food, clothes, or even a scooter. But during the feud, the role of these boys became darker. Some were armed. Some pulled triggers. Others were killed, their lives spent cheaply in a war they could not possibly understand. Teachers in Scampia later recalled seeing students with pockets full of cash one day and news of their death in the paper the next. Childhood itself had been stolen, devoured by an endless cycle of crime. Women in the shadows. Another hidden layer of the feud was the role of women. In the old traditions of the Camorra, women were expected to remain silent, to live in the shadows of their husbands, brothers, or sons. But the feud forced many into roles they had never imagined. Some became couriers, smuggling weapons or drugs in baby carriages, pretending to be ordinary mothers. Others took over entire operations when their husbands were arrested, transforming into leaders out of necessity. Still others became mourners, their voices echoing through funerals, their cries filling the streets with a grief so raw it seemed to tear at the concrete itself. And always, there were the mothers who buried their sons. Sons killed at 16, 17, 20. Sons who had never seen beyond the walls of Scampia, whose only inheritance was a gun and a grave. Gomorrah. Telling the untellable. If the feud had remained confined to Naples, perhaps the world would have soon forgotten it. But one man made sure that did not happen. In 2006, journalist and writer Roberto Saviano published Gomorrah, a book that tore away the veil of silence around the Camorra. Saviano described with detail and courage how the clans operated, how the drug plazas worked, how the feud had drenched Naples in blood. He named names. He revealed secrets. He wrote about Gelsomina Verde, about the Di Loro Empire, about the secessionists. The book exploded like a bomb. Translated into dozens of languages, adapted into a film and later a television series, Gomorrah forced the world to see Scampia not as a distant, anonymous slum, but as the epicenter of a modern mafia war. But the price was high. Since 2006, Roberto Saviano has lived under permanent police protection. The Camorra declared him a traitor, a dead man walking. He could not return to his old life, could not walk freely in his own city. His freedom was sacrificed so that the truth could be told. The Second Scampia feud. One might think that with the arrests of Cosimo Di Loro, Rafael Amato, Cesare Pagano, and their soldiers, the violence would finally end. But Camorra wars are never so simple. By 2012, a new wave of bloodshed erupted. This conflict, sometimes called the Second Scampia feud, pitted splinters of the Di Loro clan against each other. Sons fought cousins. Old allies turned into enemies. It was as if the very air of Scampia was poisoned with violence, ensuring that each generation would inherit not peace, but war. The numbers tell their own story. Dozens killed once more, funerals echoing through the same streets, mothers mourning in the same courtyards. The Hydra had grown new heads, and the cycle continued. Trauma written in concrete. Today, if you walk through Scampia, you see buildings like the Vele di Scampia, the Sales, vast concrete towers built in the 1960s with dreams of modern housing. Instead, they became fortresses for the Camorra, drug plazas stacked vertically, a maze of stairwells and blind corners perfect for lookouts and ambushes. For years, the Vele symbolized everything wrong with urban planning, poverty, and neglect. To the outside world, they became an image of despair, a backdrop for news reports and documentaries. Inside, they were a cage. Children played in courtyards littered with syringes. Families lived next to stash houses. Police rarely dared to enter without military-style raids. The feud etched itself not only into memory but into architecture. The buildings themselves seemed scarred, their concrete walls whispering of gunfire, their stairwells echoing with the footsteps of killers and the cries of the grieving. The human cost. When historians count the dead, they often stop at the official numbers. 60, 70, perhaps 100. But the true cost cannot be measured in corpses alone. How many children grew up without fathers? How many mothers lost their sanity in grief? How many ordinary people, who never touched a weapon, carried trauma in their hearts for decades after? There are wounds invisible to statistics. Wounds that live in the way people flinch at sudden noises, in the way neighbors distrust one another, in the silence that falls when certain names are mentioned. This is the true legacy of the feud, a community taught to expect violence as normal, a generation robbed of hope. Lessons of the feud. What, then, can we learn from the Scampia feud? First, that unchecked power breeds chaos. Paolo di Loro's empire, built on discipline and profit, collapsed the moment that discipline broke. His sons, driven by pride and arrogance, unleashed a war that destroyed more wealth than it created. Second, that poverty is the soil in which violence grows. Scampia was not simply unlucky. It was abandoned, by the state, by institutions, by opportunity. Where there are no jobs, crime becomes an economy. Where there is no justice, revenge becomes law. Third, that silence is complicity. For decades, the Camorra thrived because the world looked away. Only when the murder of innocents like Gelsomina Verde forced attention did people speak. But even then, too often, outrage faded while the blood continued to flow. A voice in the darkness. Imagine now, for a moment, walking those streets at night. The courtyards are quiet. The neon glow of drug plazas is gone, swept away by raids and demolitions. The towers still stand, though some are crumbling, slated for demolition. The air is heavy, as if it still remembers the cries of mothers and the staccato bursts of automatic rifles. You can almost hear it, the whispers of boys sent to their deaths, the laughter of bosses in hiding, the footsteps of police raiding stairwells, the final scream of a girl burned alive for nothing. This is not cinema. This is not fiction. This is Scampia. The endless cycle. And yet, as history shows, the cycle has not truly ended. Arrest one boss, and another rises. Destroy one clan, and another forms. Poverty remains, corruption endures, and the demand for drugs ensures that business never stops. The feud of 2004 to 2005 was one chapter, brutal and unforgettable, but only a chapter. There were feuds before it, and there have been feuds since. Naples lives under the shadow of the Camorra still, its people trapped between survival and fear. Final reflection. The story of the Scampia feud is not only about criminals and their wars. It is about a city caught in the jaws of history, about ordinary lives crushed by forces too vast to fight. It is about power and its corruption, about greed and its cost, about violence that begets only more violence. And it is about memory, the memory of Gelsomina Verde, of Montanino and Salerno, of the countless unnamed dead who will never appear in books or films but whose absence is felt every day in the streets they once walked. When we speak of the feud, we must remember them. Because in the end, the war was not won by Cosimo or Amato, by D. Loro or the secessionists. It was not won by anyone. It was only endured, by the people of Scampia, by the mothers and children and neighbors who had no choice but to survive. Closing words. And so, as this story ends, we return to the beginning. A father builds an empire. A son, impatient, tries to seize the throne. Allies become enemies. Friends become executioners. And a city bleeds. The feud of Scampia was not destiny. It was a choice. Choices made in arrogance, in greed, in the hunger for power. Choices that left graves instead of legacies. And as long as such choices are made, the cycle will continue. But perhaps, in remembering, in telling these stories, in refusing silence, we can at least honor the dead. Perhaps we can learn that the cost of violence is always greater than its reward. This was Scampia. This was the feud. This was the war that turned a neighborhood into a battlefield and left scars that will last for generations.